HMS Indefatigable was the lead ship for the class of battlecruisers named for her, being essentially an enlarged version of the preceding Invincible class. Indefatigable epitomized Admiral Jackie Fisher's idea of a battlecruiser, being fast and lightly armored. Commissioned in 1911, she saw extensive service in the Mediterranean and was there when the First World War broke out, participating in the chase for SMS Goeben and Breslau as they made their way to the eastern Mediterranean in the relative safety of the Ottoman Empire. Staying in the eastern Mediterranean in case the German ships attempted a breakout, she helped bombard Ottoman positions in the Dardanelles. Returning to the United Kingdom in February 1915, she joined the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron with her sisters Australia and New Zealand. Being present for the Battle of Jutland, she was at the rear of Admiral Beatty's line. She and her counterpart in the German line, HMS Von der Tann, the two oldest battlecruisers present, fired salvo after salvo at each other. And 14 minutes after opening fire, at 4:03, Indefatigable was struck by multiple salvos. In the maelstrom of the battle, the first of 3 British battlecruisers was lost in a tremendous explosion. All of her crew, except for a couple of men, went down with the ship. Before we get into the loss, I'd like to tell you all a little more about HMS Indefatigable, her armor, and some context to the fleet she was fighting in. Indefatigable was commissioned in February 1911, along with her sisters New Zealand and Australia. The 3 battlecruisers were an addition to the 1908 building program, after the press stirred up public opinion due to the expanded German building program. In essence, the ships were enlarged versions of the preceding Invincible class, where I think R.A. Burt in British Battleships of the First World War has an interesting quote. He writes, "Admiral Fisher's dictum, speed is armor, was never better exemplified than in this class. Their extremely poor protection made them vulnerable as capital ships. Some of the changes as compared to the Invincible class were, the belt abreast A and Y turrets were reduced 6 inches to 4 inches, right forward on the belt was reduced from 4 inches to 2.5 inches, with the 2.5 inches thick armor plate carried to the stern. The main deck armor of 3/4 of an inch outside the forward bulkhead was suppressed, while the main deck armor over the magazines was increased to 2 inches. The lower deck in the forward section was increased to 2 inches, while the aft section was reduced to 2 inches. The armor arrangements for Australia and New Zealand were modified as compared to Indefatigable. For the first 6 months of the war, Indefatigable was stationed in the Mediterranean and missed the Battle of Dogger Bank. Dr. Norman Friedman, in his book The British Battleship 1906 to 1946, discusses the lessons learned from Dogger Bank according to Admiral Beatty. The main point was that Beatty did not believe the German shells were that effective, especially the 11-inch guns, and that his ships were hitting effectively, though they were not hitting fast enough. This idea about a faster rate of fire was prevalent in the Royal Navy before the war and during, especially in the battlecruiser squadrons, with a faster rate of fire being preferred over careful calculation. This obsession with speed led to unsafe practices. To quote Dr. Friedman, Beatty's ships could not fire as rapidly as he might have expected at Dogger Bank because, over the past few years, standard fleet practices had been to overload magazines and shell rooms. Cordite magazines was normally stowed in fireproof Clarkson cases. Cordite cartridges were removed from the cases when they went into the hoists. The fuller the magazine, the greater the congestion of the cases at the bottom of the hoist caused. Beatty was not the only one concerned with the rate of fire. After Dogger Bank, his commander Admiral Jellicoe circulated a gunnery order pressing for a higher rate of fire and opening fire more quickly, on the ground that in itself, the British fire on the ships would make it more difficult for the German gunners. That is, rapid fire was both offensive and defensive. Well, where are the unsafe practices? It just seems like they wanted a higher rate of fire. The real problem was how the officers chose to solve the problem. They had 2 ways, we're again taking from Dr. Friedman. One was to stow bare charges in the turrets, in the working chambers, in the handling rooms below the turrets, placed there to break up the direct path between the turret and the magazine, and at the bottom of the hoists. In effect, the working chambers and handling rooms became ready-use magazines carrying unprotected charges. A second means of firing more rapidly was apparently to remove the anti-flash doors between the magazines and the spaces at the bottom of the hoists so that the cartridges could be passed more quickly. Both practices contravened magazine regulations. With that being said, let's get to our story. Admiral Beatty, the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons, along with the 5th Battle Squadron of Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, set off from the Firth of Forth late in the evening of the 30th of May, 1916, as Admiral John Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, had departed earlier in the evening to support the advance of the battlecruisers. Beatty headed east over the North Sea as British intelligence understood the German scouting groups under Admiral Franz von Hipper and the High Seas Fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer were making an advance into the North Sea to engage and destroy a portion of the Grand Fleet, ideally at least. A possible target was Beatty's ships. As Nick Jellicoe writes in his book Jutland: The Unfinished Battle, the Germans could read Beatty's character perhaps better than Beatty realized. They knew that he would run into the chase, and that this was their chance to lure a portion of British naval forces into the waiting guns of Scheer, heading north not far behind with the main battle fleet. Between 2:20 and 2:30, either side's cruiser forces had spotted smoke over the horizon, and within an hour, the two sides came into view. Upon seeing the ships at around 3:30 p.m., Hipper understood that Beatty intended to cut him off from his home base, and made a turn of 180 degrees to the south. Where I think a quote from Gary Staff's Skagerrak, The Battle of Jutland Through German Eyes, is interesting. High tension dominates with all the crew, as after scarcely 1 hour after sighting British light forces, smoke clouds and heavy masts of ships climb over the horizon. I hear more, as Admiral Hipper on the Admiral's Bridge said to his Chief of Staff in his Bavarian dialect, "Rada, I'll eat my broomstick if that's not Beatty again." Intending to close the gap, Beatty increased speed, leaving the 4 Queen Elizabeth-class ships behind. By 3:40, the battlecruisers had formed a single line ahead steaming south, with Lion leading, followed by Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, New Zealand, and Indefatigable. However, the Germans opened up the battle when at 3:48, while smoking a cigar, Hipper gave the order to open fire. The two sides began engaging each other, where on the German side, George Hasse, SMS Deflinger's first artillery officer, has this to say. The 6 ships, which had been proceeding in 2 columns, formed a single line ahead, like a herd of prehistoric monsters. They closed on one another with slow movements, spectre-like, irresistible. At the last, there was a dull roar. The Lutzow is firing her first salvo, and immediately the signal "open fire" is hoisted. In the same second, I shout, "Salvos fire," and the thunder of our first salvo crashes out. On the British side, Flag Captain Alfred Chatfield on HMS Lion has this to say. We were now steaming at 19 knots on a south-southeasterly course. The enemy battlecruisers were now rapidly closing on us, steering southwesterly. The range receiver on the bridge showed 20,000 yards. I was on the compass platform with my navigator, Commander the Honorable Arthur Strutt, and my small staff. Beatty remained for a time on his bridge. I wanted him to come on the compass platform and send a message to Seymour, telling him to advise Beatty that the range was closing rapidly, and that we ought to almost at once to be opening fire. This was a duty I had handed over to the Chief of Staff, but I could get no reply. The Vice Admiral was engaged in an important message to the Commander-in-Chief. 18,000 yards. I told Longhurst to be ready to open fire immediately. The turrets were loaded and trained onto the leading enemy ship, the Lutzow. This was found in Jutland, 1916, Death in Grey Waters by Nigel Steele and Peter Hart. As I discussed in the past, fire distribution was an issue for the British side during the opening stage of the battle. Beatty intended for Lion and Princess Royal to fire on the leading German ship Lutzow, while the other ships followed along down the line, with Queen Mary firing on Deflinger, Tiger on Seydlitz, New Zealand on Moltke, and Indefatigable on Von der Tann. Lion and Princess Royal fired on Lutzow as they should have done, but Queen Mary fired on Seydlitz, leaving Deflinger unmolested. If we were discussing other ships like Queen Mary or Deflinger, this would be an important talking point. However, since we're discussing Indefatigable, we'll be at the back of the line. Indefatigable, one of the oldest British battlecruisers currently engaged, faced off against the oldest German battlecruiser, Von der Tann. On the German side, we turned to Korvettenkapitän Marholtz, Von der Tann's first artillery officer. For a long time, I occupied my post on the direction indicator periscope and directed my battery and rangefinders on the enemy, which was magnified 15 times through my glass, and I could make out the enemy's ships. Fire distribution from left, the signalman called through the armored slit, and I slowly counted along down the enemy line through my periscope. The loading of the guns had been ordered some while before in the turrets. The men had shoved armor-piercing shells into the barrels, on which a not-too-friendly greeting for the English had been written in chalk. The adjusted range was 162 hectometers, then finally the release came. Open fire, and at that same second the first salvo crashed out against the enemy. Almost at the same time, one saw the clear muzzle flash and the spiraling, yellow-brown smoke cloud climb over the ship. Accurately, the middle of the 16th Division of the direction indicator lay under the middle funnel of the battlecruiser Indefatigable, the name of which I did not know at the time, only recognizing the type. In this private duel, as Robert K. Massey describes it, the two oldest, smallest, and slowest of the battlecruisers dueled at the rear of their respective lines, starting from 349 onwards. Again, turning to Marholtz, I guarded myself against observing hits and adhered strictly to observing the fall of shot. My young lieutenant in the mast also reported a hit. Straddling, good rapid, followed the order after the impact, and salvos now followed in brief intervals, salvos following salvos into the air. The enemy fired slowly. You could see the flash of their salvos, and those who had time could use a stopwatch to determine the enemy fall of shot near the ship. Still, the enemy did not shoot well, and many salvos came nowhere near the target. Probably over there they had poorer visibility than us. Our light ship color made it difficult in the hazy weather. Meanwhile, the fire of Von der Tann was extraordinarily successful. The enemy sometimes disappeared completely into the surrounding columns of water. Von der Tann was putting out a withering barrage. In a short space of time, she fired 52 11-inch shells and 38 5.9-inch shells. The ranges between the two ships varied between 14,000 and 18,000 yards. On the British side, at the rear of the line, Indefatigable was putting out some serious fire of her own. In that short span of this rancorous ship-on-ship duel, she fired some 40 rounds of her 12-inch guns. But, according to Marholtz, who was fired upon by those shells, it wasn't very accurate. Gary Staff reports that during this phase in the battle, Von der Tann was not hit. Although later on in the battle, she would receive several hits and have all 8 of her guns put out of action for periods of time. Nevertheless, the gunnery duel continued, and shortly past 4 p.m., Indefatigable was struck in multiple places, where we turn to Gary Staff and German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations. At 5:03, it was observed that Indefatigable was struck by 2 or 3 shells from one salvo around the aft gun turret. A small explosion occurred, and Indefatigable swung out of line to starboard, probably to throw off the German aim. She appeared to be settling by the stern when 2 projectiles from the next salvo struck her, one on the forecastle, one on the forward turret. After a further 30 seconds, there was a tremendous explosion forward, and the ship lay over to port and capsized. It is thought the aft magazine of the X turret exploded, and then the forward magazine of the A turret. A total of 57 officers and 960 men perished with the explosion, while 2 survivors were later picked up by the German torpedo boat S-16. For clarity, Staff is using the German account for the battle, and therefore it is recorded at 5:03 p.m. Another account found in Staff's book is that of Marholtz, as he witnesses what his guns were doing. He writes, "Meanwhile, the fire of Von der Tann was extraordinarily successful, and the enemy sometimes disappeared in the surrounding columns of water. As Indefatigable was so covered, seemingly she ceased fire and attempted to withdraw from the deadly fire by a zigzag course. But thanks to the good glasses, each movement could be recognized. The enemy turned away, and despite the straddles, I changed 1 hectometer ahead, and she turned nearer, 1 hectometer back, and changed the deflection a little to the side, to the bow of the enemy. While the salvo was underway, a new position for the indicator was ordered, and I immediately received the new movement and deflection ahead for the new position of the enemy. Then, 14 minutes after the opening of fire, the enemy was fatally damaged. In the direction indicator periscope, briefly after the impact of a salvo, I saw a giant explosion in the aft gun turret. A bright flash of flame, and the ship's debris was thrown in a wide arc through the air. Seemingly, it was the turret roof, which, through the pressure of the explosion inside, had been lifted off. The next salvo gave the ship the rest. It hit further forward, and soon after the impact, a tremendous black smoke cloud climbed from the ship, reaching double the mast height, and the enemy ship disappeared. Probably an oil bunker was hit and burning. For the sake of certainty, another salvo was fired into the smoke cloud, but scarcely would have reached the target that had already vanished into the waves. Although the auxiliary observation officer was certain that the enemy had sunk, I was skeptical because I knew from experience just how easily at this range one can be mistaken. People often see what they want to see. Only after the smoke had cleared and nothing was to be seen, and the other officer assured me again and again, did I allow myself to be convinced and report the success to the commander. Below decks, the news that the enemy had been blown up spread like wildfire, and in my headphones, I could hear the men's cheers. From the other British ships, the loss of Indefatigable was seen from multiple angles. One of the most notable angles was from a navigating officer as he looked back on Indefatigable. We were altering course to port at the time, and it seemed as if her steering was damaged, as she did not follow around in our wake, but held on until she was about 500 yards on our starboard quarter. While we were still looking at her, she was hit again by 2 shells, one on the forecastle and one on the fore turret. Both shells appeared to explode on impact. There was about 30 seconds, and then the ship completely blew up. The main explosion started with sheets of flame, followed immediately by a dense dark smoke cloud that obscured the ship from view. All sorts of stuff was blown into the air, a 50-foot picket boat being blown up about 200 feet, apparently intact, though upside down. Another interesting location comes from the battleship Malaya, as she and her sisters attempted to catch up with the battlecruisers. Sub-Lieutenant Carlson watched through a 5-inch slit in the armor of the battleship, writing, "I could not see the enemy who were on the far side of the battlecruisers, but I could see the splashes of their shells falling around our ships." Both Tilstone and I were watching, absolutely fascinated, and suddenly he said, "Look at that!" I thought for an instant that the last ship in the line had fired all her guns at once, as there was a much bigger flame, but the flame grew and grew till it was about 300 feet high, and the whole ship was hidden in a dense cloud of yellow smoke. The cloud hung in the air for some minutes, and when it finally disappeared, there was no sign of the ship. Although I did not know the order of the battlecruiser line, I had a feeling it was the Indefatigable, in which I had a great friend. As stated in the quote from Gary Staff earlier, 1,017 men went down with Indefatigable. In the chaos and confusion of the explosions and subsequent sinking, a couple of men survived and were picked up by a German destroyer later. I've seen some debate to the exact number of survivors. 2 to 3 seems to be the range, as there appears to be some confusion regarding signalman John Boyer, who would die of his injuries. I'll let you all do some research on that, as I want to focus on 2 other signalers, C. Falmer and Seaman Elliott. Starting with Falmer, who shortly before 4 p.m. was ordered aloft to clear the signal flags, which had become entangled as the ship maneuvered, where Falmer recounts, "The message came up for someone to go aloft to clear the flags. I went up, took my sea boots off first, climbed out the foretop, and went up the Jacob's ladder right to the very top. I unfurled the flag, and I sat on the wireless yard looking around, naturally watching the firing. There was a terrific explosion aboard the ship. The magazine went. I saw the guns go up in the air just like matches. 12-inch guns they were, bodies and everything. She was beginning to settle down. Within half a minute, the ship turned right over, and she was gone. I was 180 feet up and thrown well clear of the ship. Otherwise, I would have been sucked under. I was practically unconscious, turning over really. At last, I came to the top of the water. When I came up, there was another fellow named Jimmy Green, and we got a piece of wood. He was on one end, and I was on another end. A couple minutes afterwards, some shells came over, and Jim was minus his head, so I was left on my lonesome. There was nothing to be seen, only the 5th Battle Squadron coming along. They started to open fire, and the German shells were dropping short. I could feel them myself in the water, my feet, my legs. They went, and about half an hour later, 4 German cruisers came along, so I ducked my head down because probably if they had seen me, they would have put a shot at me. They would have done, to put you out of your misery, you see. Then they cleared off and it turned dark. There wasn't a sound, nobody near me. It was pitch dark. I'd given up all hope practically. I let go once, but I struggled back again quickly. Between 2:30 and 3, all of a sudden, I could hear something coming towards me. I gazed up and it was a destroyer. They stopped and 2 German sailors got down on the fender, grabbed me by my shoulders and pulled me aboard. I didn't remember anything till the next morning. When I came to in the engine room, they were mopping me down with waste. I was smothered in oil fuel. Able Seaman Elliott was also on the top when the other 1,017 men had been killed. Unfortunately, I don't have his account. I will remember to place a link to the Imperial War Museum's website where you can listen to Falmer say his account in his own voice, a truly remarkable piece. One last place we haven't heard from was the flagship Lion. For that, we turn to the excellent Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the Winning of the Great War at Sea by Robert K. Massey. He writes, "Stricken, with smoke pouring from her shattered hull, Indefatigable rolled slowly onto her side, all the while driving through the water. Then the huge vessel turned completely over and plunged, taking with her 1,017 officers and men. Only 2 seamen survived, both shell-shocked and delirious when they were pulled from the sea hours later by a German destroyer. Curiously, because of the din of the battle, and the Indefatigable was the last in line, many in Beatty's squadron were unaware what had happened. From Lion's Bridge, an officer looked back to admire the following ships, with their huge bow waves and flashing broadsides. Astern of the rear ship was a colossal pall of gray smoke. I gazed in amazement and, at the same time, realized that there was only 5 battlecruisers in our line. Where was the 6th? The unpleasant truth dawned on me that the cloud of smoke was all that remained of the Indefatigable. When it comes to the losses of the battlecruisers at Jutland, I've done a video covering all 3 British battlecruisers lost and some of the reasons for their losses and the sudden explosions. I don't want to go into as much detail here as I did in that video, and because I'm not a historian, I don't want to be mistaken as such. But for the sake of clarity and wanting to put an emphasis on some things, going back to the beginning with a quote from Dr. Freeman and some of the possible reasons for the loss of Indefatigable were the unsafe cordite handling practices. One was to stow bare charges in the turrets, in the working chambers, in the handling rooms below the turrets, placed there to break up the direct path between the turret and the magazine, and at the bottom of the hoists. In effect, the working chambers and handling rooms became ready-use magazines carrying unprotected charges. A second means of firing more rapidly was apparently to remove anti-flash doors between the magazines and the spaces at the bottom of the hoist so that the cartridges could be passed more quickly. Both practices contravened magazine regulations. In that same vein, an interesting quote comes from Nigel Steele and Peter Hart. "It was indeed the hapless Indefatigable. In a highly visible disaster which occurred right in front of the aghast battlecruiser fleet, a salvo from the Von der Tann had crashed down onto the ship at 4:02. By accident or by design, the Indefatigable sheared out a line to starboard and a few seconds later was hit by a second salvo, which provoked a huge explosion. Accounts to exactly what happened are slightly contradictory. Until her sunken wreck can be examined in detail by marine archaeologists, it will not be possible to say with certainty what the sequence of events was, but it seems likely that the cordite charges in the X-turret were ignited and a flash passed down to the magazines aft. However, it is entirely possible that a shell penetrated right through the armor and set off the magazine directly. That same sentiment of uncertainty is found in Nick Jellicoe's description of the event, where he writes, "Finally, at 4:02, at a range of around 16,000 yards, the German shells tore through the thin plating just above the armored belt by X-turret and exploded in the magazine. A second salvo hit A turret and may have caused a cordite fire. 30 seconds after the superstructure was hit, a ripple of fire seemed to race from the bows right the way down back the 19,000-ton battlecruiser as their magazine exploded." With all of that being said, the Battle of Jutland continued around the wreck and the dead. Just a short time later, the battlecruiser Queen Mary exploded in a similar manner, and after Princess Royal was straddled and disappeared into water columns, it prompted Admiral David Beatty to turn to his flag captain Alfred Chatfield and say the now famous or infamous line, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." The battlecruisers eventually turned north, and the battle raged until early the next morning, something we have discussed numerous times on this channel. The wreck of Indefatigable settled at the bottom of the North Sea, where the wreck has been located. I'll post a link to some more information on that as well as a link to a video on the losses at Jutland I discussed previously, and a video where you can actually see the wreck of Indefatigable. At the time of release, we'll be a little over a month and 108 years from the loss of Indefatigable. If you found the video interesting, remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.